Good afternoon. My name is Benjamin Nguyen, and I'm here to speak to you about the suffrage in Sudan and the product of this suffrage, which is the Lost Boys of Sudan. Now look at this photo here. This photo here is a photo of children and their families who have sought refuge from Sudan. Now eventually these children that you see in the front will have to be separated from their families to help find ways of providing for their family. It's my purpose to educate and inform you about the suffrage in Sudan and the product of these suffrage, the Lost Boys of Sudan. Now, if the proper awareness and attention is not given to this country, the world will be faced with a present-day form of humanitarian crisis, and unfortunately, what might end up and become a genocide. Now, though the Lost Boys are a product of Sudan's recent history, the history of Sudan actually dates back much further than that, as far back as Egyptian times. Now, it was because of the drying of the Sahara Desert where people had to migrate from there and eventually landed in the country of what is known now as Sudan. The population eventually evolved into a social hierarchy, and eventually Nubian kings were converted to Christianity. Now, a short time later, Muslim Arabs invaded and Islamization began, and ultimately the persecution of Christians. However, a treaty was eventually signed and actually brought peace to the country for the following 700 plus years. Now, after these 100 plus years of peace, Europe decides they want in on it. They want a piece of the land. So they come in and they start doing their own land expeditions. Now, during these expeditions, Britain eventually prepared the North for self-government. However, the South was excluded from this, and ultimately leads us to our first civil war. Now let's turn our attention to the first Sudanese civil war, which ultimately actually lays the groundwork for our Lost Boys of the second Sudan Civil War. Now, in partnership with Britain, the North and the South were recognized as separate regions, but were held as one governing body. The South actually had no choice in fear of the North takeover. And eventually a rebellion occurred, which led to survivors fleeing the country for refuge. Now let's turn our attention to the second Sudanese war and what gives birth to the Lost Boys. Now, the second civil war was really centralized in southern Sudan. And actually the institution of Islamic law is what sparked this war. Now, according to the UN Refugee Agency, over 2.5 million lives have been lost due to the continued civil unrest and unrest in the country of Sudan. Now, in fear of being taken, 20,000 boys sought refuge from Sudan, which leads us to the Lost Boys. Now, of these Lost Boys, they ranged in the ages of 7 to 17, and these boys had to trek by feet from Sudan to Ethiopia. Now, once they reached Ethiopia, by the year 1991, communist overthrow took over the country in Ethiopia, which led these boys to flee Ethiopia and back to Sudan. Now, what happens when they go back to Sudan? Of course, still continued civil unrest in the country. So these boys couldn't seek refuge in their home country still. They eventually had to flee again to the country of Kenya. Now, those who did survive were able to reach camp. And according to a New York Times article, 4,000 boys were given refuge to the United States due to worldwide humanitarian response and just the overall outrage of how bad the conditions were in the country of Sudan. So let me summarize real quick the suffrage in Sudan and the Lost Boys. Now, the country of Sudan has actually endured decades and decades of civil unrest. Unfortunately, according to the UN Refugee Agency, Sudan is headed in the direction of a third civil war. Now, if peace talks between the government and the rebels fail, we could very well be looking at another genocide and unfortunately another civil war in Sudan. The situation is just very urgent, and the country needs our attention. Now, fast forward to present-day Sudan. A new generation of Lost Boys are now surfacing. And not only Lost Boys, we now have Lost Girls. So Sudan has, like I said, essentially been at war for 50 plus years. And despite all these previous attempts of peace, there seems to be no end in sight. So without the increase in awareness and humanitarian efforts, the road of humanity, unfortunately, is not going to run through the country of Sudan. Thank you for your time, and now I'm open to taking any questions.
How did they get the name Lost Boys?
Lost Boys is actually humanitarian workers who were helping out with the efforts nicknamed these kids Lost Boys in reference to Peter Pan. If you remember Peter Pan, there's a bunch of kids in there who didn't have parents. They were labeled as the Lost Boys.
Oh, I see.
How many individuals in Sudan are of the Islam religion?
It's going to be crazy. 97% of the country of Sudan are of the Islamic faith. So you can kind of see the fuel and the power behind the suffrage there.
How many people call Sudan home?
30 million people call Sudan home, so small country, but very populated.
Question. So how many of the Lost Boys sought refuge in the U.S.?
As I mentioned earlier, after constant seeking refuge, eventually in Kenya, 4,000 Lost Boys are given refuge to the United States.
Okay.
All right. Thank you guys for your time.
No bowing, I'm listening.